And if you set yourself on going against him, you're going to miss out on your inheritance. C.S. Lewis, I think, gives us an interesting picture to help us to maybe hold this idea. It's an image that he gives in his book, The Great Divorce. It's a beautiful book if you want to read. It's this picture, contrast of heaven and hell in C.S. Lewis's language. And in this story, he gives a fictional journey from the Shadowlands, which could be this idea of a waiting place, a purgatory kind of idea, Shadowlands into God's new creation. And the people get on the bus in the Shadowlands, and then they take that bus ride into the new creation. And what happens in this scene is that once they get into the new creation, they find that the new creation is actually too real for them. They come to realize that although they had been what they thought were solid beings on earth, they were like physically flesh and blood, once they arrive in this new creation, they realize that they lack the substance that they thought they had. And what they are is they're actually shadows of their perceived former selves. And so if they're going to survive in this new creation, they need to gain substance somehow. As they step off the bus and begin to walk on the grass in this new creation, they begin to cut their feet on the grass. They're not substantial. They're not weighty enough to make an impression on the ground even. The grass itself is too hard for them, too real for them, too true for them. They lack the substance they thought they had. They're shadows of the people that God had intended for them to be by the time they had arrived here. And Paul is saying, don't become partners with people who live these ways, because they're shadows of who they should be. That's not their real selves. That's not what God intends for them to be. That's not a solid substance, not a solid human. Don't become co-workers, is the word, with these people, because they're actually working themselves out of an inheritance by doing this. Just before this, Paul has said something else that is pretty strong as well. I don't know, have you read this one? We read it through. He says, don't let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. And how you understand that. Sometimes I don't know what comes to mind when you think of the wrath of God, but it's kind of, think of this outpouring of anger on people, this fire of God or something. And I think it's helpful for us to think about what this actually looks like. The most comprehensive place that Paul talks about wrath of God in the New Testament is in a passage in Romans chapter 1. So I want to look at that to understand what Paul can be saying here. Romans 1 from verse 18. I've just shortened a bit because it was a bit longer, but I'll read you through this and we'll see what it says, and you might want to send this more yourself. He says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all godliness and unrighteousness of men. So he's saying this is how the wrath of God is revealed. On ungodliness and righteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. He says this is what these people are like. Although they knew God, he's saying they knew God because they live in this world and should be able to see him through the creation, that God is real. They did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. Same type of language as we have in Ephesians. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Same language as we have in Ephesians. Claiming to be wise, they became fools And they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. They set up idols, basically. So instead of recognizing God as creator of all and worshipping him, they found things in the world that they thought, we're going to worship this as their God. And in Ephesians, what's the example of that? Other people worshipping them as gods for bodily pleasure. And so what does Paul say God does? What does this wrath of God look like? Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. And he goes on to describe that more. And then he says again, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. And he goes on and describes that more. And then he says, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. Do you see how the wrath of God is revealed? By God giving people over to the desires of their hearts. He simply lets them follow through their desire, and that is the expression of the wrath of God. This is the way the wrath of God is enacted, people handing themselves over to their own self-destruction. In Romans, in that passage, God gave them up to what they were giving themselves up to, which is the same as what Paul says in Ephesians. They have become callous, have hardened themselves against being able to acknowledge and see God, and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. It's interesting that in Romans, God gives them up. This is the expression of the wrath of God. Here in Ephesians here, they're giving themselves up to these practices. And the reason why God is angry about this, reason why this is the wrath of God expressed on them, is because it harms other people. It does damage to people. His creation made in his image is what God cares about. And this damages people, and he doesn't like it. So Paul is saying, just because you now understand the world differently doesn't mean that your decisions don't matter. Doesn't mean you do whatever you want. Doesn't mean you follow your desires. On the contrary, your decisions are more meaningful now. And yet, Paul, in this passage, what he's really doing for us is acknowledging that there are real challenges that we face in changing the decisions that we make. Both vicious and incontinent action do real damage in our world. And it's easy to say, once you become a Christian, well, you know you don't do vicious damage because your mindset changes. But just don't do incontinent action, okay? Just don't do it. That's what some people are told us. Just don't do that. And if you do, just stop. Well, Paul recognizes, I think, that it's not always as simple as that, is it? There's actually a process that we go through as people. It's not like your desires change immediately. It's not a simple matter of just condemning an action and telling someone to stop. These traits that Paul's talking about, addiction in these kinds of behaviors is very, very prevalent in our world. Which also means it's very, very prevalent in our churches. I think it's often especially prevalent in churches because people have this simplistic idea that once I become a Christian, once I have no longer this vicious action where my thinking is wrong, I should just all be changed and better. That's not true. That's not what happens. That's not reality. That's not life. It's especially true in churches, I think, sometimes because we're not free to talk about our struggles. We're afraid of condemnation of other people who will judge us. Christians are pretty good at that. Because we've thought about this simplistically. We've thought about it with simplistic condemnation. Think about the use of pornography, for example. If before seeing Jesus' vision of a new way of living and loving other people, I may rationally approve of consuming pornography as I see it a way of fulfilling what I think I need. Yeah? That's vicious action. It's not that this person would be seeing pornography even as a bad thing. It's actually a good thing that gives me what I think I need. But becoming a Christian, your mindset changes. Your approach to these images and the impact on the person as well as on you as well as on others changes. When I come to see Jesus' alternative way and understand his purposes for sex, my understanding of pornography and whether or not that is good or not changes, doesn't it? I move beyond vicious action, that is. And yet, do your desires change immediately? Do those things in your life that has led you toward that behavior change immediately? Incontinent action now toward virtuous action. How does that change happen? And this is our wrestle. I think it is what Paul is highlighting to us, that there's a change that needs to happen, but it's our wrestle. Remember when we're talking about Ephesians, we're not just talking about you as an individual on your own. He's talking about yous. So it's not the person who has the struggle. It's not only their issue, it's our issue. How do we help one another to move in a direction toward virtuous action? Disordered desire is something that it was a mystery that Aristotle was trying to understand. And he saw two reasons why, once someone understood something as being less than worthwhile activity, continued in that behavior. His two reasons that he saw was, one, uncontrolled desire. Somehow desires can get out of control. And second, he saw habit as the other reason. Here is Kent Dunnington. This is a great book called Addiction and Virtue. He unpacks Aristotle and then Thomas Aquinas and then thinks about that in terms of addiction. Here's him talking about Aristotle, and this is what he says. Sometimes the reasoning needed to overcome incontinent action is simply not completed. He thinks reason should help us to move toward virtuous action. That reason is simply not completed due to the interruption of passion or our desires. Sometimes just those desires are strong in us. We don't know how to get out of those desires in order to do what we rationally think is right. And then he says also, sometimes, although the reasoning might be completed, we might follow through in that thought process. It's not followed due to the weight of habit. The things we're used to doing, the things we practice, just carry us on in a certain way of behavior. Passion and habit. St. Augustine is a famous saint that describes his own experience in the same way. He says the consequence of a distorted will is passion. By servitude to passion, habit is formed. And when I did not resist the habit, it became a necessity. These were the links that formed my chain by which a harsh bondage held me under restraint. The new will, which was beginning to come to life in me and made me wish to serve you freely and enjoy you, my God, the only sure source of pleasure, was not yet strong enough to conquer my older will. hardened as it was by old habit. And so my two wills, one old, the other new, one the servant of the flesh, the other of the Spirit, were in conflict with one another. And between them, they tore my soul apart. The conflict of the wills. Paul himself describes this in Romans. And it is a real part of being human. It is a real part of change into the likeness of God. And some people think that this should just happen automatically. And it doesn't. It doesn't happen automatically. This is what Paul's warning about. And his warning is, I think, an invitation into learning a new way. If those are your patterns of living, begin to learn a new way because you can. And if you feel like you can't, that's normal. So don't get stuck in that feeling if you can't. Let's talk about it. Let's learn together. This is exactly why we have a group here dedicated to this. It's a new group, so you might not even know that's running now, but it's a group called Sozo. Sozo is a group that meets on Tuesday nights every week, and it aims to help people walk this path, helping the formation of new habit to replace what we don't think is worthwhile. It's a peer support group to help in recovery. It's a program that's based on Alcoholics Anonymous. You may have heard of that. It's a 12-step program. We've developed this one ourselves. Matt here has led this group, and it's a 6-step program. Here's what the Alcoholics Anonymous book describes as what they're doing, is they're creating a program that is a plan for a lifetime of daily living. A program that is a plan for a lifetime of daily living. That sounds like discipleship, doesn't it? Program that is a plan for a lifetime of daily living. This, like if you're in this situation, I don't know who I'm talking to, but I know I'm talking to people in this room, that if this is a situation that you need help with, then this is a group for you to get help and to develop a program that's a plan for a lifetime of daily living following Jesus, learning from him. When Paul calls us to walk in love, this is the call to a program of lifetime of daily living. To learn new habits of living from God, whose mercy acts to overcome the vicious action, whose mercy overcomes the incontinent action, whose mercy leads us through the continent action toward virtuous action in the world to live like he would live if he were us. So that actually our desires can change to be good desires too. That's the surprising thing about this whole process, isn't it? Your desires can change to become good desires. This passage has taught us that God actually allows the old creation to destroy itself, if that's what the old creation would choose. But God's ultimate response and his ultimate desire is to rescue people. How does he do that? Well, he says it exactly here. Not by giving people up to their desires, but by him giving himself up for us. It's exactly the same phrase that he uses. Instead of giving people over to their passions, Jesus comes and gives himself over for us. He's teaching us, therefore, to invert this approach whereby we learn to willingly lay down ourselves for others instead of using them for ourselves. Therefore, be imitators of God, he says, as children that he loves, and walk in love. as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. A fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. We sang in that song, I'll never know how much it cost to see my sin upon the cross. The thing is that we actually do know how much it cost, don't we? We know that it cost God his life. That he laid that down for us. Of course, we sing that song as an expression of emotion. I can never comprehend how great this love is. But the reality is we do know how much it cost. It cost God everything. He says, what's your response to that? What's your response to that, to the life that you've been given? You get to choose. And he leaves it with us. Let me pray. We thank you for your mercy, God. We thank you for your kindness. We thank you for a picture of goodness, of a worthwhile life, of a different vision. And we invite you to lead us on that pathway of change, a difficult pathway of change, but one that makes us more substantial, makes us solid people, so that we know what it is to live in this world as you've designed us to live, and so we can continue into the world beyond it. I want to pray for my brothers and sisters here, your children, who feel stuck, who are scared, and who want your help. Your Spirit is so decisive and will point out exactly what you're asking us. And yet you're so gentle with it and unforceful. And so we invite you just to do your work as a surgeon, to cut out those things that aren't right. Your work as someone that softened leather. What's that person called? That just makes us able to be malleable again. Your work of pouring water onto a dry sponge so it can receive more water again. Do your work in us. Soften us. Give us courage. Give us understanding of one another.
Amen. I think we're very fortunate. Thank you, Steve. It was very clear and helpful. But then we got to work out how to do it, don't we? I like it that it's us learning together and supporting one another. And it can be awkward to talk about some of these things because they're personal things and they're private things, and we don't like to often admit our struggles in different things, but that's what we've got to learn to do to fulfill what Paul is teaching. That's what he expected the Ephesians to do with each other, is talk with each other about this stuff so that they could help along one another on the way. I don't know if anyone has a question or a reflection that they would like to share. If you're not part of a life group through the week, this is why we have these groups, to listen to this message and then get together and try and help one another put it into practice and unpack it. So I'd encourage you to do that together. Steve will write some questions that will guide that discussion. But if you're not part of our life group, come and have a chat to one of us and we can tee that up for you. Just give you a minute though. Does anyone want to ask a question or something that wasn't quite clear in your head, or an implication that you would like Steve or someone else to tease out, or just a reflection? Just give you a minute to do that. Don't be shy. Don't be embarrassed.